Before the day continued any further, something in her stopped moving. The phone screen glowed in her hand, but for a moment the noise of the world fell away, and a quiet voice rose from somewhere deeper than thought. It said that she had already been called 7 times, 7 moments, 7 warnings, 7 chances to turn back before something significant arrived in her life, and she had not understood any of them. She had called them coincidences, bad timing, disappointments, or strange feelings she could not explain away no matter how hard she tried. But none of it had been an accident. Each one had been a voice reaching for her across the noise of her own life, and now that the 7th call had already passed unnoticed, something greater was waiting just beyond the horizon. Something was coming, and she was not yet ready to meet it. It was easy to believe, in the rush of an ordinary day, that nothing watched, that nothing remembered, that the small ache in her chest meant nothing at all. Yet the truth was far heavier than that. She had been seen in every quiet hour when she thought no one noticed her struggle. She had been observed in the silence after the lights went out, when worry crept in and sleep refused to come. There was a reason this particular message had reached her on this particular day, and it had nothing to do with chance. Something in her life was shifting, even if she could not yet name it, and the unrest she had been feeling for weeks was not a flaw in her spirit but a signal that change was already underway. She had felt it building for some time now, that low hum of exhaustion that no amount of rest could fully calm, that pressure behind her ribs that arrived without invitation and refused to leave. Friends asked if she was fine, and she said yes, because it was easier than explaining what she could not explain herself. She carried battles that no one else could see, fighting quietly through afternoons that looked calm on the outside while storms moved underneath. And through every one of those silent battles, she had not been alone, even when loneliness felt like the only truth she had left. Every tear that fell in private had been witnessed. Every breath she had to force herself to take had been counted. There had been signs, small ones at first, easy to dismiss, scattered through ordinary weeks like seeds she never noticed falling. A conversation that lingered longer than it should have. A thought that returned again and again no matter how she tried to push it aside. A sentence in a passage she read once, years ago, suddenly surfacing in her memory with no clear reason why. None of these things had been random. They had been the early outlines of a pattern she had not yet learned to read. Threads of a larger design being woven long before she noticed the shape it was taking. 7 of those threads mattered most, 7 moments strung together across the recent chapters of her life, each one a call she had not recognized as a call at all. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something invisible, a weariness no amount of sleep can fully resolve, because the source of it lives somewhere deeper than the body. She had grown skilled at hiding that exhaustion from the people around her, smiling through meetings, answering messages on time, showing up for obligations even when showing up cost her more than anyone could see. From the outside, her life looked manageable, even successful in certain seasons. But the truth underneath that surface had been far more complicated, layered with questions she rarely allowed herself to ask out loud. Fears she kept folded small enough to carry without anyone noticing the weight of them. None of that complexity had gone unnoticed, even in the moments she felt most certain that no one understood what she was carrying. Every quiet hour of doubt had been witnessed with a kind of attention most people never receive from anyone in their lives, not even those closest to them. The version of her that existed behind closed doors, tired and uncertain and sometimes afraid of her own thoughts, had never been a secret kept from the larger story unfolding around her. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to be addressed directly, rather than left to ache in silence indefinitely. Before revealing what was coming, it mattered first to walk back through those 7 moments, because nothing about the future could be understood honestly without first understanding the past that had prepared her for it. Each call had a shape of its own, a season, a wound, a doorway. None of them had arrived to punish her. Each one had arrived to wake her, gently at first, and then, with increasing urgency, as the unheard calls accumulated. The first of those 7 calls had come quietly, almost too quietly to notice, slipping in through an ordinary day the way fog slips beneath a closed door. It began as a feeling that refused to be named. She would be standing in a kitchen, or driving down a familiar road, or lying awake at 3 in the morning, and a sense would rise in her chest that something was not right, even though nothing visible had changed. There was no evidence for it, nothing she could point to and explain to a friend over coffee, and so she learned to call it nerves, or stress, or simply being tired. She pushed it down because life was too busy to stop and listen to a feeling with no name. Bills needed paying, children needed feeding. Deadlines refused to wait for anyone's intuition, no matter how persistent it became. But that unexplainable feeling had never been anxiety dressed up in disguise. It had been a warning, delivered the only way it could be delivered before words were ready to carry it, through sensation instead of language. It arrived just before a decision that would have cost her more than she could afford, a choice that looked reasonable on paper but carried consequences she could not yet see. It arrived just before she let herself fall deeper into a relationship that drained more than it ever gave back, a connection that wore the appearance of love while quietly hollowing her out from the inside. It arrived just before she accepted a job that fit her resume but never fit her spirit, a position that paid the bills while slowly starving everything else about her that mattered. Each time, she felt the warning and pushed past it anyway, because the warning was easy to dismiss and the path in front of her seemed clear enough without it. Each time, the cost of ignoring that quiet unease revealed itself later, sometimes weeks afterward, sometimes years, but it always revealed itself eventually. And still, even after she ignored that first call entirely, walking forward into the very thing she had been warned against, she was not abandoned for her stubbornness. The voice did not grow tired of speaking to someone who would not yet listen. It simply waited, patient as ever, and prepared the next call for the moment she would be ready to receive it. The second call arrived differently, not as a quiet feeling, but as a door slamming shut directly in front of her. An opportunity she had wanted badly disappeared without warning. A plan she had built carefully, brick by brick, collapsed in a single afternoon. A dream she had nurtured for years failed to become the reality she had imagined for it, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of expectation. She remembered exactly where she was standing when the rejection came, remembered the specific words used to deliver the news, remembered how the air seemed to leave the room entirely as her plans folded in on themselves. The disappointment that followed was sharp and immediate, the kind that settles into the chest like a stone. Then came the anger, quieter but more corrosive, the kind that asks why effort and faith had not been enough to earn the outcome she deserved. And underneath both of those feelings sat a deeper question, one she was almost afraid to ask out loud. If there was truly a greater design watching over her life, why had it allowed this particular door to close at the exact moment she needed it open the most? She turned that question over for weeks, sometimes months, without finding an answer that satisfied the ache it left behind. What she could not see in that moment, what almost no one can see while standing inside their own disappointment, was that the closed door had not been cruelty. It had been protection wearing an unfamiliar face. Behind that door waited circumstances she was never shown, complications that would have unfolded slowly and painfully had she been allowed to walk through. The version of her future that door would have led to was not the future intended for her, even though it looked, from where she stood, like exactly what she wanted. There is a particular kind of mercy that arrives disguised as loss, and very few people recognize it while the wound is still fresh enough to bleed. She had called it rejection at the time, because rejection was the only word large enough to hold the size of her disappointment. But what felt like rejection in that moment had actually been rescue, arriving early enough to spare her from consequences she would not understand until much later, if she ever understood them fully at all. The door closed not because she was unworthy of what waited behind it, but because something better, something she could not yet imagine, was already being prepared along an entirely different road. That truth would not comfort her immediately. Truths like that rarely do, but it would prove itself true eventually, the way most deep truths eventually do. Months later, looking back from a vantage point she could not have reached without first walking through that disappointment, she would notice details she had been incapable of seeing while standing inside the loss itself. She would notice the timing of certain conversations that only became possible once that earlier door had closed. She would notice the strength she had built simply from surviving the disappointment, strength she would not have developed had everything gone according to her original plan. None of this erased the pain of the original closing, and it did not need to in order to still be true. Some lessons only reveal themselves in hindsight, arriving late but arriving honestly, and that lateness does not make them any less real. The third call came while she slept, slipping past the defenses of her waking mind and arriving instead through the strange, symbolic language of dreams. She woke one morning with her heart pounding, the details of the dream already dissolving even as she reached for them, leaving behind only fragments and a feeling that refused to fade no matter how quickly the day's demands tried to crowd it out. There had been water, rising fast and dark. There had been a road she could not see the end of, stretching ahead into shadow. There had been a door, closed, and beyond it, a light she could sense but not reach, glowing faintly through a crack she could not widen, no matter how hard she pushed. She told herself it meant nothing, the way most people dismiss their dreams in the bright, practical light of morning. But the images returned, not every night, but often enough to matter, often enough to leave an impression that lingered through entire days, surfacing unexpectedly in the middle of unrelated conversations or quiet drives home. There is a language older than words, one that speaks through symbol and feeling rather than sentence and argument, and the deepest part of a person often understands that language long before the conscious mind catches up to translate it. The soul hears what the mind has not yet learned to listen for, and sometimes it tries to deliver that message while the body sleeps, when the noise of the day can no longer interfere. The rising water in her dream was never about drowning. It was about an emotional flood building somewhere in her waking life, gathering force in places she had not yet acknowledged, needed her attention. The dark road represented a season of uncertainty she had not yet entered but was already approaching, one she would need courage to walk rather than answers to navigate. The closed door, appearing again just as it had in waking life, echoed the same lesson from a different angle entirely, reinforcing a truth she had not yet accepted. And the light beyond it, faint but undeniable, was the promise that even in the darkest stretch of that road, she would never be walking it utterly alone. That dream had not been meaningless, however quickly the morning light convinced her otherwise. It had been a warning delivered in the only language capable of reaching her in that particular season, when her waking mind was too busy, too defended, too occupied with the practical weight of daily life to receive a message delivered any other way. She forgot the dream by mid-morning most days, the way dreams are designed to be forgotten, slipping back into the ordinary business of breakfast and traffic and emails. But forgetting it consciously did not erase what it had planted. Some seeds grow in soil too deep for memory to reach, and they do not need to be remembered in order to eventually bear fruit. She would later recognize, though not for some time, that the recurring images in that dream had each corresponded to something unfolding quietly in her waking world, arriving in symbol months before they arrived, in fact. The water she could not stop rising had matched almost exactly the flood of emotion she would eventually face when the heartbreak came. The dark road had matched the uncertain season that followed, longer and harder than she expected. None of it had been coincidence, even though coincidence remained the easiest explanation available to her at the time, the explanation requiring the least amount of trust in something she could not yet see clearly. The fourth call arrived through absence rather than presence, through someone leaving rather than something happening. A person who had occupied real space in her life, someone she trusted, someone she had built a portion of her future around, stepped away without warning or stayed, but became someone unrecognizable, distant in ways that hurt more than distance ever should. Maybe it ended in a single difficult conversation. Maybe it ended slowly, through silence accumulating over weeks until the relationship simply stopped breathing on its own. Either way, she was left holding the wreckage of something she had believed would last, wondering what she had done wrong to deserve losing it. The pain that followed was not the kind that fades quickly. It hollowed her out in places she had not known could be hollowed, leaving an emptiness shaped exactly like the person who was no longer there. She replayed conversations looking for the moment everything shifted. She blamed herself in the quiet hours when blame felt easier to carry than confusion. She wondered, more than once, whether she would have been better off never trusting that deeply in the first place, never opening a part of herself that now felt permanently exposed to the cold. What she could not see, standing in the wreckage of that loss, was the larger shape of the story unfolding around her. Not everyone who enters a life is meant to remain in it forever, and some people are removed, not as punishment, but as protection, cleared away to make room for a future that could not have unfolded with them still standing in the middle of it. There are seasons when love means staying, and there are seasons when love means letting go, even when letting go is not the choice being made willingly by the person left behind. Sometimes the removing is done for reasons that take years to become visible, if they become visible at all. She cried because they left, and that grief was real and deserved every tear it received, never to be dismissed or rushed through, simply because a greater purpose waited somewhere on the other side of it. But the leaving had not been abandonment in the truest sense, even though it wore that exact appearance in the moment it happened. It had been a kind of love too complicated to recognize while the wound was still open, a protection extended toward a future she could not yet see and would not have chosen to trade for, had anyone offered her the choice in advance. Some absences are mercy wearing grief's clothing, and it often takes years before that disguise falls away enough to be seen clearly. There would come a day, further down the road than she could see from where she currently stood, when she would understand exactly why that particular person could not remain in her story. Perhaps their presence would have anchored her to a version of herself she needed to outgrow. Perhaps their continued closeness would have prevented her from reaching toward people and opportunities that mattered more for the chapter ahead. The reasons would not always be obvious in the immediate aftermath of loss, and she did not need to understand them fully in that moment in order for them to be true. Grief and trust were allowed to exist together, side by side, without one canceling out the other. The fifth call arrived as heartbreak, the kind that does not simply hurt but fundamentally changes the architecture of a person from the inside out. It came during the darkest stretch of her recent years, when loss piled on top of loss, until she could no longer remember what steady ground had felt like beneath her feet. Something collapsed in her, some structure she had relied on without ever realizing how much weight it had been holding, and in its absence she felt the full, frightening weight of being alone with herself in a way she had never experienced before. There were nights during that season when the loneliness felt almost physical, a presence in the room rather than an absence, pressing down on her chest until breathing required effort. She stopped reaching out to people because she could not find the words to explain what she was carrying, and silence began to feel safer than the exhausting work of trying to be understood by anyone, including herself. The version of her that existed before that heartbreak began to feel like a stranger, someone she remembered fondly but could no longer locate inside her own reflection. And yet, in the exact center of that collapse, something unexpected began to stir. It was in the wreckage of that breakdown, not in any of her earlier successes or moments of confidence, that she first began genuinely searching for something larger than herself. Comfortable seasons rarely produce that kind of searching. It takes the floor falling away to make a person look up instead of simply forward, to ask questions she had never needed to ask before because life had never demanded that level of honesty from her until now. Pain has a way of stripping away every distraction that keeps a person from facing what actually matters. That heartbreak, devastating as it was, had not arrived to destroy her, even though destruction was exactly what it felt like while she was living through it. It had arrived as an invitation disguised in the costume of catastrophe, an opening carved out of collapse, a doorway built from the very thing that seemed designed to ruin her. When everything else disappeared during that season, every plan, every certainty, every person she thought would remain by her side no matter what came, something else remained steady underneath all of it, quiet and unshaken, present in the wreckage the same way it had been present in every version of her life that came before. It is a strange mercy, the way certain seasons strip a person down to almost nothing, leaving behind only the parts of them too essential to be removed. In losing nearly everything she thought defined her, she found, almost by accident, the parts of herself that had never actually depended on any of those external things in the first place. That discovery would not have happened in comfort. Comfort rarely forces anyone to look that closely at what remains when everything else is taken away. It took the heartbreak, painful as it was, to reveal a foundation she did not know she had been standing on the entire time. The sixth call did not arrive through circumstance at all. It arrived through sensation, a heaviness settling over her spirit that she could not trace back to any specific event or trigger. Nothing dramatic had happened recently. Nothing had visibly changed. And yet she found herself carrying a weight she could not explain to anyone who asked, a pressure that sat behind her sternum like an unspoken warning, a sense that something significant was approaching, even though every external sign suggested life was simply continuing as normal. She tried reasoning her way out of the feeling, the way practical minds usually try to dismiss what cannot be measured or proven. She told herself it was simply stress accumulating from an ordinary week, simply exhaustion catching up with her after months of pushing through without enough rest. But reasoning never fully dissolved the sensation, and it lingered through days that otherwise had no reason to feel heavy at all. There are signals the spirit receives long before the conscious mind has gathered enough evidence to understand them, intuitions that arrive ahead of explanation rather than behind it, the way certain animals sense a storm building on the horizon, long before the first cloud becomes visible to human eyes. That heaviness had not been imagination, nor weakness, nor an overactive mind inventing problems that did not exist. It had been preparation, delivered quietly because the moment it was preparing her for had not yet fully arrived. Something larger was already gathering shape just beyond the edge of her ordinary days, and her spirit, more perceptive than her schedule allowed her to admit, had picked up on its approach long before there was anything visible to point toward as proof. The instinct to take that internal pressure seriously rather than dismissing it as nothing is one of the most overlooked forms of attentiveness a person can practice, and ignoring it too often comes at a cost that only becomes clear in hindsight. And then, not long after that heaviness had settled fully into her days, came the seventh call, arriving in a form so ordinary that she almost missed it entirely, the way the most important moments in a life often slip past disguised as nothing unusual at all. The seventh call did not announce itself with drama or spectacle. It came instead through something small, something she nearly scrolled past, nearly skipped over, nearly dismissed the way she had dismissed countless ordinary moments before it without consequence. Maybe it arrived through a sentence in a passage she happened to read at exactly the right hour. Maybe it arrived through a conversation with someone who said exactly what she needed to hear without realizing the weight their words carried. Maybe it arrived through a message much like this one, reaching her on an evening when she had no particular reason to expect anything significant from the hours ahead. She almost missed it the way she had almost missed every call before it, distracted by the ordinary business of living, the errands and obligations and small concerns that fill the space of an average day, until there seems to be no room left for anything larger. But something made her pause this time. Something held her attention a few seconds longer than usual, long enough for the message underneath the message to finally reach her. This was not simply another ordinary moment passing through an ordinary life. This was the final call before an entirely new season began. The last quiet knock before the door that had been gently rattling for so long finally opened in earnest. There comes a point in every unfolding story where patience gives way to urgency, where gentle nudges become something closer to insistence, not out of frustration but out of love that refuses to let someone sleep through the exact moment they most need to be awake. That point had arrived for her now. The waiting was nearly finished. The quiet preparation that had been happening in the background of her ordinary days, often without her awareness, was reaching its conclusion, and what remained ahead would not wait indefinitely for her to notice it on her own schedule. Time had not run out, but it had grown precious in a way it had not felt before, urgent enough that further delay carried real consequences worth taking seriously. The seventh call was not an ending, however final it might have felt in the moment it arrived. It was a beginning, the closing of one chapter functioning simultaneously as the opening line of the next, the way a door does not exist except at the exact point where one room ends and another begins. Everything that had come before, every ignored feeling, every closed door, every strange dream, every painful absence, every heartbreak, every unexplained weight pressing on her spirit, had been preparation for this exact threshold. None of it had been wasted. None of it had been random. It had all been leading here, to this precise moment, to this exact point of decision. What approached now on the other side of that threshold was not something to fear, even though uncertainty by its nature tends to feel frightening before it reveals its true shape. Something was coming into her life that would not simply replace what had been lost across these 7 calls, but would exceed it entirely, built on a scale too large to have been built any other way than through everything she had just walked through. It would not arrive as one single, isolated event, but as a season, a stretch of time defined by qualities her recent years had been sorely missing. New opportunities were forming, Doors opening in places she had not even thought to look, openings that would not have existed had the earlier doors stayed shut, had the earlier relationships continued, had the earlier path remained unchanged. Healing was forming too, slow but genuine, reaching into wounds she had carried so long she had nearly stopped noticing they were there, beginning the long work of closing what circumstance and heartbreak had torn open. Restoration was forming, returning to her, in altered and often improved form, certain things she believed had been permanently lost, proving that loss is not always the final word on anything, no matter how convincingly it presents itself in the moment. Change itself was forming, deep and structural, the kind that does not simply rearrange the surface of a life, but reorders its foundation, shifting the very ground a person stands on until they realize, often gradually, that they have become someone slightly different than who they were before, someone steadier, someone clearer about what actually matters now that so much unnecessary weight has been stripped away. And beneath all of these visible changes, something quieter was forming as well, a spiritual breakthrough less easily named than the others, but no less real, a deepening of conviction, an expansion of trust, a settling of peace into places that had been turbulent for longer than she could comfortably remember. This new season would not arrive all at once, the way storms sometimes arrive, sudden and overwhelming. It would arrive gradually, in layers, the way morning light moves slowly across a room until the whole space is bright, without anyone noticing the exact moment the darkness fully lifted. Some mornings she would wake and feel nothing different at all, and on those mornings patience would matter more than anything else she could offer. Other mornings she would notice small shifts, a conversation that felt lighter than expected, an idea that arrived with unusual clarity, a sense of ease in a relationship that had felt strained for longer than she wanted to admit. Each of these small shifts would be evidence, quiet but real, that the season she had been promised was already underway, even on the days it did not feel that way. What was being prepared for her now was larger, in every meaningful way, than everything the 7 calls had required her to release along the way. That is rarely how loss feels while it is happening. Loss convinces a person, in the moment it occurs, that nothing afterward could possibly be worth what was taken. But the architecture of an unfolding life often works differently than grief predicts it will, building toward outcomes too large to have fit inside the smaller plans that had to be cleared away first to make room for them. Hope was justified now, even in the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what shape this new season would ultimately take. Anticipation was justified, the kind that leans forward rather than backward, looking ahead rather than replaying what has already passed. And faith was justified most of all, the quiet confidence that what comes next does not need to be fully understood in advance in order to be trusted. There was no reason to fear what approached, no matter how unfamiliar its outline appeared from this current distance. The greater danger was never the uncertainty of the future itself. The greater danger was the possibility of missing what was already actively unfolding, distracted by old wounds or familiar fears long enough to overlook the very thing those 7 calls had been preparing her to receive. Attention, in this particular season, mattered more than answers. Readiness mattered more than certainty, and presence, simply showing up fully for what each new day revealed, mattered more than any attempt to control or predict exactly how the larger story would eventually unfold. Looking back now across all 7 calls, a pattern finally became visible that had been impossible to see while living through any single moment in isolation. The unexplainable feeling that arrived first had been a warning, delivered before the danger itself, meant to spare her from costs she would not have recovered from easily had she walked further down that road. The closed door that followed had been protection, redirecting her away from a future built on the wrong foundation toward one being constructed, unseen, somewhere else entirely. The forgotten dream had been a message, delivered in symbol because language alone could not yet carry what needed to be understood. The person who was removed had been mercy, painful in the moment, but necessary in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. The heartbreak that followed had been an invitation, the collapse of an old structure clearing ground for something sturdier to eventually be built in its place. The heaviness that settled over her spirit had been preparation, alerting her in advance to a shift she could not yet name or understand. And the 7th call, arriving quietly through the most ordinary of moments, had been the threshold itself, the final knock, before an entirely new chapter opened. None of this meant she had been abandoned during any portion of the journey, even during the seasons that felt most isolating while she was living through them. She had been loved through every single one of those 7 calls, even the ones she ignored, even the ones that hurt too much in the moment to feel like love at all. There had been no abandonment in the silence that sometimes followed her unanswered questions, no indifference behind the delays that frustrated her, no cruelty hidden inside the losses that broke her heart open. What looked, in isolated moments, like absence or distance, had actually been attentiveness, too patient and too gentle to announce itself loudly, watching closely even when she felt completely unwatched, working steadily even when nothing visible suggested any work was being done at all. If a message like this one had managed to reach her today, breaking through the noise of an ordinary evening to land exactly where it needed to land, it was because her story was not yet finished, because there remained more ahead worth staying present for, more worth preparing carefully to receive. The natural response to recognizing a pattern like this one is not relief alone, though relief is certainly part of it, but a kind of quiet resolve, a decision to remain close to whatever larger design has been unfolding through every one of these 7 calls, rather than drifting back into the distraction that allowed so many of the earlier signals to pass unnoticed in the first place. There is a kind of prayer that fits this exact moment, less a request for one specific outcome, and more a request for the posture needed to meet whatever comes next, with steadiness rather than fear. It asks for protection through the uncertain stretch of road that still lies ahead, protection from threats, seen and unseen, from mistakes that might otherwise be repeated, from distractions that might otherwise pull attention away from what matters most in this particular season. It asks for wisdom sufficient to recognize opportunity when it finally appears, since opportunity rarely announces itself as clearly as hindsight eventually reveals it to have been. It asks for peace deep enough to remain steady even while important answers are still pending, peace that does not depend on having every detail resolved in advance before it is willing to settle in and stay. And perhaps most importantly of all, it asks for the simple capacity to keep listening, to recognize the next call whenever it arrives, in whatever unexpected form it chooses to take, rather than letting it pass by, unnoticed the way so many of the earlier ones nearly did. That capacity is not a talent some people are born with, and others are not. It is a practice, built slowly through attention paid consistently over time, through a willingness to pause in the middle of busy days long enough to ask what a particular feeling, or door, or dream, or absence might actually be trying to communicate, rather than rushing past it toward whatever comes next on the schedule. This kind of prayer does not require elaborate language or a particular setting to be sincere. It can be spoken in a parked car before walking into work, or in the quiet minutes before sleep, or in the middle of washing dishes when the mind finally has room to wander toward something larger than the task at hand. What matters is not the polish of the words, but the honesty behind them, the willingness to admit uncertainty rather than performing a confidence that does not yet exist. Protection asked for honestly carries weight that polished language alone could never replicate. Wisdom requested sincerely opens doors that performance, however eloquent, tends to leave closed. There is also a kind of gratitude that belongs in this moment, even before the new season has fully revealed itself, even before any of the promised healing or restoration has had time to take visible shape. Gratitude for having survived 7 calls that could easily have gone unanswered forever. Gratitude for a story that has not, despite every difficult chapter, come to an end. Gratitude for whatever quiet attentiveness has been tracking her progress through losses she once believed were unsurvivable, proving patiently, call after call, that survival was never really in question, only the timing of her own awareness. If this message has reached her today, it is because her story is not yet finished, because there is still more being written, more being prepared, more waiting just beyond what current circumstances allow her to see clearly. Staying close to whatever quiet, patient presence has been speaking through all 7 of these calls is not a passive choice but an active one, requiring attention renewed daily rather than assumed once and forgotten. The season ahead will eventually reveal, in its own time and its own way, exactly why those 7 calls mattered as much as they did, why each one arrived precisely when it did, rather than sooner or later, and why none of the pain woven through them was ever wasted, no matter how it felt while it was being lived through. For now, what matters most is simply this: the calling has not stopped, and it will not stop, regardless of how many times it has been missed before today. There remains time to listen differently than before, to notice what previously slipped past unnoticed, to recognize warning as warning rather than dismissing it as nerves, to recognize protection as protection rather than mistaking it for rejection, to recognize preparation as preparation rather than confusing it for random heaviness with no purpose behind it. The 7 calls were never about punishment. They were never about testing her until she failed enough times to deserve abandonment. They were about love patient enough to keep reaching, again and again, until the message finally landed somewhere it could take root and grow. Somewhere ahead, in a chapter not yet written, she would look back on this exact moment, this evening when the message finally landed clearly enough to be understood, and recognize it as a turning point. Not a dramatic one, not the kind announced by sudden change or visible transformation overnight, but a quiet one, the kind that only reveals its significance gradually, the way a single decision to pay closer attention eventually reshapes an entire life simply by being repeated, day after day, long enough for the pattern to take hold permanently. Something is coming. That much has been made clear across every one of these 7 calls, woven quietly through losses that once seemed senseless and doors that once seemed cruel. What approaches now does not require fear, only readiness, only attention, only the willingness to remain present for what unfolds, rather than retreating into old patterns of distraction or doubt. The story continues. It has not ended, and it was never abandoned, not for a single moment across any of these 7 calls. However lonely certain stretches of the journey may have felt while they were actually being lived, stay close, stay attentive. The next season is already arriving, quietly, the same way every one of the 7 calls before it arrived, waiting only to be recognized for what it truly is.